You ever walk into a place and feel like the air itself is holding its breath? Yeah, that was Aspen Creek County Courthouse that morning. And I mean the whole place. The marble floors, the old wooden benches, even the damn fluorescent lights buzzing above. Everything felt scared. Or maybe tense. No, tense isn't enough. It felt like the entire room knew something was about to snap. Something big. Something nobody was ready for. People weren't talking like they usually do before a hearing. No casual gossip. No bored jurors checking their phones. No lawyers pretending to look confident. All you heard were these tiny whispers. The kind that die halfway out of someone's mouth because they're afraid someone might hear the truth. And the truth was simple, brutal, and honestly kinda heartbreaking. This case was hanging by a thread, a fragile one, a 3-year-old child thin thread. A prosecutor in a navy suit leaned in toward another attorney and whispered, not even whispered, more like breathed, "If she can't talk, we're done." The other guy nodded, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push back a headache that had been there for days. Someone else muttered, "Derek Cole is gonna walk right out that door if that kid freezes. 3 years old, man. 3. And you know, I get it. I really do. A toddler? A toddler as the only witness in a violent felony case? It sounds insane. It sounds unfair. It sounds hopeless. But that's exactly why the energy in the room felt like an overinflated balloon. Everyone was scared that the tiniest wrong move, a sneeze, a whisper, a dropped pen, would make the whole thing explode. I swear, even the judge looked nervous. Judge Halford, normally a rock, the kind of guy who stares down murderers like he's challenging them to blink first. But that day, he kept adjusting his glasses, over and over, like his hands needed something to do, so his mind wouldn't crack open under the pressure. And then there was Ranger, the big German shepherd lying beside the witness stand. He didn't move much, just lay there, head on his paws, ears twitching at every sound. But even he felt the tension. You could see it in the way his eyes stayed locked on the courtroom doors, like he was waiting, watching, protecting. Officer Blake Harris, his handler, kept smoothing down his uniform, tried to look calm, but you could see his knee bouncing like it was trapped on an invisible electric wire. He knew, better than anybody, what was about to happen, or what could go horribly wrong. And nobody said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. How the hell do you expect a 3-year-old to testify? I mean, toddlers barely hold a conversation without getting distracted by a shiny object or their own shoe. How do you put one on a witness stand and ask her to relive the worst moment of her life? It doesn't sound fair. It doesn't sound possible. Honestly, it sounds cruel. But the case didn't have anyone else. The only person alive who saw what happened to Anna Thompson was her daughter, little Mila, barely taller than the microphone she would have to speak into. And God, you could feel the doubt swirling around the room like smoke. One juror whispered, There's no way she's gonna last 5 seconds up there. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth and said, "Poor baby. Why are they even making her do this?" Someone else murmured, "If she shuts down, Derek walks." And there he was, Derek Cole, sitting at the defense table with that look. You know the look. That smug, corner-of-the-mouth smile that Petun says, "I've already won, and you all just don't know it yet." He leaned back in his chair like he was in some private movie theater, fingers drumming on the table, rhythmic, cocky, confident. Every tap felt like a countdown. Tap, tap, tap. Then he said, under his breath but loud enough to be heard, "That kid ain't gonna say a damn word." And something about the way he said it, the arrogance, the certainty, made a few people flinch. One juror even shifted in their seat, like they wanted to stand up and shout. But nobody did. Because honestly, they weren't sure he was wrong. And the worst part? Neither were the prosecutors. They kept glancing at the door, waiting, hoping, dreading. It was like counting down to impact. And then, right when the room felt seconds away from collapsing into panic, Judge Halford finally spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "Bring the witness in." You could hear the scrape of a chair. Someone gasped. Someone dropped a pen. A tiny clink that echoed like a gunshot. Officer Blake stood up straighter. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked forward, eyes sharp as a knife, and the entire courtroom leaned forward with the exact same thought. Please, please let her be able to speak. Because if she didn't, if little Mila Thompson stepped through those doors and froze, if she cried, or shut down, or got scared, or couldn't push past the trauma, then Derek Cole would walk out of Aspen Creek County Courthouse a free man. And the truth, the real truth, might never see daylight again. The air went still. Nobody moved. And the doors began to open. Right when the whole courtroom felt frozen in place, the doors finally swung open. You could actually hear the hinges groan a little, like even the building wasn't ready for what came next. At first, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Everyone just stared at that doorway, the way people stare at the edge of a cliff, because they know one more step could change everything. And then, Mila Thompson appeared. This tiny, fragile little girl who looked like she'd brought the entire winter of Colorado in with her. She stood there in this oversized pink coat, the kind that swallowed her whole body, sleeves hanging past her hands. And she clutched that silver stuffed bunny like it was the only warm thing left on earth. And maybe, for her, it was. It took her a second to step fully inside. Not because anyone pushed her, not because she resisted, but because she looked lost. Lost in the way someone looks when they've wandered too far into the cold and aren't sure how to get back. Her little boots, these tiny beige ones with worn-out soles, tapped against the floor. But the sound was so soft, It felt wrong inside such a huge courtroom, like a whisper in a cathedral. Someone in the back row quietly said, "Oh, God," not out of fear, out of heartbreak, because the moment Mila lifted her face, you saw it. Those eyes, not crying, not angry, just empty, like she'd used up all her childhood in one night and didn't have any left to spare. You know the way some kids look like they've been playing all morning, full of life and noise? Yeah. Mila was the opposite of that. She looked like silence had wrapped itself around her and refused to let go. Her gaze drifted across the room, not landing on anyone, not the judge, not the lawyers, not even her aunt shaking in the front row. It was like she wasn't standing in a courtroom at all, like she was still trapped somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere cold. And honestly, it hit the entire room like a punch to the chest. Even the jurors, supposed to stay detached, shifted in their seats, trying to hide how their hearts cracked a little. One woman touched her collarbone, like she needed to hold herself together. Mila kept walking, slow, unsure. She wasn't crying, but her face had that expression kids make right before they crumble. The tight mouth, the shaky chin, the eyes that don't blink because blinking means tears. Her silver bunny dangled from her hand, but she kept pulling it to her chest like she was scared someone might take it away, or like letting it go would make the world collapse. The bailiff tried giving her a soft, gentle smile, but Mila didn't look at him. She just kept inching forward like she was walking through invisible snow. And in a way, she was. Everyone in that room could feel it. That cold wrapped around her. The kind that doesn't come from weather, but from trauma. Judge Halford, who'd seen hardened criminals break down, actually leaned back as if the sight of her had knocked the wind out of him. His voice, usually deep and commanding, softened. "Take your time." It came out almost like a whisper, and the whole place fell even quieter. If silence could get quieter, that's what happened. People weren't whispering anymore. They weren't doubting. They weren't speculating. They were watching. Watching a 3-year-old walk like she carried something far heavier than any evidence folder or legal argument. And maybe that's why the atmosphere shifted, like the tension cracked open and let something sadder, deeper, slip in. A man in the gallery wiped his eyes. A woman pressed her fingertips to her mouth. Not because they feared the defendant, not because they cared about the legal drama, but because they saw a child who had already lost too much. When Mila reached the step to the witness stand, she paused, not dramatically, just stopped, like her legs weren't sure they could go farther. Officer Blake, standing beside Ranger, took half a step forward, ready to catch her if she fell. But Mila didn't fall. She just looked around the room with those blank, haunted eyes. Eyes that didn't belong on a face that small. And for a moment, everyone in that courtroom shared the same painful thought. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't have to do this. But she was here. And somehow, she kept going. She lifted her foot, then the other, climbing the small step, moving like a little ghost drifting through a world too heavy for her. When she reached the chair, the one built for adults, she didn't sit right away. She just stared at it. Quiet, frozen, fragile. The whole courtroom dropped their gaze, not in shame, but in respectful grief. People bent their heads without realizing it, not bowing, just sinking. Like the weight of her pain pressed them down. Because in that moment, everyone understood something far beyond legal strategy. They didn't need to hear her speak to feel her story. Her silence already said too much. Not loud, not dramatic, just shifted. Her eyes, those empty little eyes that had been floating around the courtroom without landing anywhere, finally stopped wandering. They froze, focused, locked on something. Ranger. The German shepherd who'd been lying calmly beside the witness stand, head resting on his paws, ears relaxed but alert. The kind of alertness only a trained K9 has, where he looks asleep but he isn't missing a single breath in the room. And the way Mila reacted, my God. It was like watching a tiny candle flicker back to life in the middle of a snowstorm. You could see her chest rise just a little higher, her shoulders drop just a little softer. Her bottom lip stopped trembling for the first time since she walked in. It wasn't a full transformation, no magical movie moment, but it was enough. Enough to make people in the gallery look up, confused, hopeful, surprised. Ranger didn't move at first. He just lifted his eyes to her, slow and steady. The look a dog gives when he recognizes a soul he's supposed to protect. And Mila, she blinked, like she hadn't blinked properly since the day everything went wrong. Then, so small it could have been missed, her fingers loosened around the silver bunny she'd been clinging to like a lifeline. One finger, then another, then all of them. And the bunny dropped. Not fell, not slipped. Just gently lowered as her hand finally let go. You could actually hear a soft gasp ripple through the seats, tiny, involuntary sounds of people reacting before they could stop themselves. Because letting go of that toy? For a kid who'd been through what she had, that wasn't nothing. That was trust trying to come back to life. Officer Blake noticed first. Time 700 mems. You could tell because his spine straightened and his eyes softened the moment he saw Mila's gaze connect to Ranger. It was like he finally breathed for the first time since the trial started. Ranger, sensing her attention, slowly lifted his head. Not jerky, not playful, just this smooth, careful motion like he was saying, "Hey, it's okay. I'm here." His ears perked up, and he tilted his head in that gentle, curious way only German shepherds can pull off. Not too cute, not too dominant, just safe. And Mila? She took one tiny step toward him, a single step. barely the length of her little boot. But in that courtroom, that step felt like an earthquake. People leaned forward. A woman clutched her chest. A man whispered, "Oh, thank God." Even Judge Halford's face, usually carved from stone, softened like a grandfather seeing his grandchild for the first time. And the room that had been suffocating under dread, warmed by maybe 1 degree, but it was enough to feel it. Mila's hands, tiny fists of fear moments ago, slowly opened. She didn't reach out yet, but the instinct was there. The recognition, that tiny human part of her that remembered Ranger, maybe from before, maybe from the night everything happened, maybe from how he found her afterward, curled up and shaking. But something was there. Something real. She stared at Ranger like he was the only familiar thing in the entire courthouse, maybe the only familiar thing left in her world. Then she did something that made even the defense attorney stop pretending to shuffle papers. She crouched down, just a tiny bend of her knees. Her pink coat ballooned slightly, hiding most of her body except her little face peeking out as she leaned forward to get a better look at Ranger. Ranger responded instantly. He lowered his head again, but this time it wasn't passive, it was deliberate. He slid his chin forward on the polished wooden rail between them, offering himself in the quiet, gentle way only a dog knows how. Not forcing, not begging, just being there. An invitation, a promise, a lifeline. And that's when Mila's expression, the blank one carved out of shock, finally cracked. Just a tiny bit. But enough that you saw the sparkle return. Not joy, not comfort, but familiarity. As if she was thinking, "Oh, I remember you." Her mouth trembled, but not from fear. From relief, slowly, her hand lifted. Not all the way, not reaching yet, but rising, hovering mid-air, shaking gently like a leaf caught between staying frozen and wanting to thaw. You could hear nothing in the courtroom except the soft patter of her breath. Then, in a barely there whisper, not meant for anyone except that dog, she said, "Ranger." Soft, fragile, hopeful. People in the front row wiped their eyes, no longer pretending to hide it. Because in that one word, one tiny breath of a name, Mila did something nobody expected. She trusted again. She trusted someone, something, him. And in a room full of adults who kept saying she'd never talk, never open up, never testify, that small act of trust felt enormous, like the beginning of a miracle. And let me ask you this, seriously, you listening? If you were sitting in that courtroom right then, would you have believed a little girl could change everything? Yes. No. Not sure yet. But I felt something. It happened so quietly, so gently, that half the courtroom didn't even process it until it was already happening. 1 second she was standing there, tiny hand hovering in the air, and the next, she took a step closer. Not a big step, not confident. Just enough that her boots made this soft little scrape on the floor. But it was enough to pull everyone back into that sharp, electric silence. The kind of silence where you swear you can hear your own heartbeat in your throat. Mila stood in front of Ranger now, barely an arm's length away, and he didn't move. Toward her. He moved with her, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. He lifted his head slowly, those dark brown eyes catching the overhead courtroom lights. And I swear, something passed between them. Not in some cheesy, magical way. No glitter, no music. But in a deeply human, deeply raw way that makes your chest tighten without knowing why. Mila took another tiny breath. Then she leaned forward and wrapped both of her hands around Ranger's head. Not tight, not desperate, but soft, careful, like she was touching something precious she thought she'd lost forever. Ranger didn't flinch, didn't jerk back, didn't even look surprised. He just let her. Like he knew, really knew, that this wasn't just a touch. It was a plea, a question, a reaching out from one wounded soul to another. Mila lowered her forehead until it rested gently on the top of Ranger's head. Her pink coat rustled. Her bunny toy slipped from her other hand and fell to the ground again. But she didn't notice this time, because her whole world, just then, was him. The courtroom was so still it felt unreal, like the building itself realized something sacred was happening and didn't dare interrupt. Even the defense attorney, Mr. Always Smug, always smirking, froze with his mouth half open, mid-whisper to his client. He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. No one could speak. No one wanted to. Then came the whisper, barely audible. Just a soft breath of sound that carried across the wooden walls and landed right into the chests of every single person watching. You remember, right? Her voice cracked on the last word. Not because she was about to cry, but because she was releasing something she'd been holding inside for far too long. A secret, a memory, a fear. And she gave it to Ranger. Not the judge, not the lawyers, not the adults who had been trying to get her to talk for weeks. Just him. The dog. The only witness who couldn't speak, but somehow understood everything. Ranger didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't shift nervously. Instead, his entire posture changed in this slow, powerful wave. His ears perked up, not sharply, but with intention. His eyes widened just enough to show recognition, like the name she whispered earlier wasn't the only thing he understood. And his chest expanded with a deep breath before he leaned forward. Only an inch, but an inch that meant everything, to touch his nose to her cheek. That's when someone in the front row gasped. Not dramatically, but the way someone gasps when they finally understand something painful. Because this wasn't a dog responding to a command. This wasn't an animal showing affection to a random child. This was a bond forged in trauma, in survival, in a moment they both lived through and never forgot. It was one soul checking on another, one survivor telling another, "Yes, I remember. You're safe." Judge Halford's grip tightened on his gavel, knuckles turning white. Not out of anger, out of something closer to awe. Officer Blake blinked hard, swallowing whatever emotion threatened to break. Through the stoic exterior he wore like armor. A woman 3 rows back pressed her hands over her mouth, shoulders shaking, trying not to sob. Even the air felt different now, warmer, less cruel. And Mila, she didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned closer. Her voice trembled again, not in fear this time, but in relief. You were there." Ranger answered her in the only way he could. His tail tapped once against the floor. Just one soft thump. But that one thump hit harder than any testimony the courtroom had heard all week. It felt like validation. It felt like truth. It felt like the beginning of something no one expected. Because right then, in that dimly lit courtroom, with the snow falling outside and the whole town watching, a dog and a child understood each other better than any adult in that room ever could. And the strangest thing? Everyone else understood it too. You didn't need words for what was happening. You didn't need logic. You didn't even need evidence. You just needed eyes and a heart. Because in one whispered sentence, one tiny plea, Mila showed the entire courtroom something they'd been doubting since the beginning. She wasn't alone on the night everything happened, and she damn well remembered, not in her body, in her eyes. They opened wider, clearer, sharper, like someone had wiped fog off a window inside her mind. She slowly lifted her head from Ranger's, and the entire courtroom felt that tiny movement like a jolt of electricity. Even Ranger adjusted, leaning back just enough to look straight at her, as if he knew something important was about to happen. And he was right. Because when Mila finally looked up, she wasn't staring into space anymore. She wasn't lost. She wasn't frozen. She was focused. Her tiny chin trembled, just once, then steadied. Her hands dropped from Ranger's fur. Her shoulders rose as she pulled a breath into her tiny lungs. And then, in this small but somehow thunderous voice, she said it. Ranger saw it. The bad man. It wasn't loud. Not at all. Honestly, if someone had coughed at the wrong second, they might have missed it. But nobody coughed. Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. It was like the whole room had been turned to stone. Then, boom! The whisper explosion hit. People jerked in their seats. Gasps shot through the air like arrows. Someone in the gallery actually said, "What did she just say?" A little too loudly. One juror's hand flew to their mouth. Another gripped the armrest like they were bracing for impact. The prosecutor shot up so fast his chair nearly toppled. Mila, sweetheart, can you?" But she wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the judge, or her aunt, or the gallery. She turned her head, slowly, steadily, toward the defense table, toward him, Derek Cole. And the moment her eyes landed on him, something wild happened. His face drained of color so fast, you'd think someone flipped a switch inside him. The smugness, gone. The arrogance, dead. The confidence, evaporated. What replaced it? Panic. Real, raw panic. His hand clenched the table, knuckles turning white. His jaw twitched. His breathing picked up, enough that even people 10 feet away noticed. Because Mila didn't just accuse a bad man. She looked straight at him as she said it. And Ranger, oh man, Ranger. That dog reacted like someone hit an internal alarm. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't leap. He did something far more powerful. He rose, slowly, deliberately, like a soldier coming to attention. His muscles shifted under his coat, ears standing tall, tail stiff, body angling slightly in front of Mila, not blocking her, but shielding her. If you've ever seen a K9 go from calm to protective in a second, you know the room felt that change deep in their bones. One woman whispered, "Oh my God, he's confirming it." And it sure looked like he was. Judge Halford slammed his gavel once, not in anger, but because he was rattled. "Order! Order in the court!" As if anyone could calm down now. Derek Cole swallowed hard. For the first time in the entire trial, he had no smirk, no attitude, no mask. He knew. The second those words left Mila's mouth, this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was truth. Time 100. The prosecutor tried again. "Mila, can you tell us what you mean by—" But he didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. Her voice had carried it all. Ranger saw it. Not imagined. Not guessed. Not sensed. Saw. The bad man. And here's the thing that cracked everyone open. Mila wasn't trembling anymore. That tiny spark of determination in her eyes didn't fade. It grew. It spread through her face like warmth after a long night in the cold. She lifted her little hand and placed it gently on Ranger's back, drawing strength from him, or maybe giving strength back. Ranger leaned into her touch. Someone sniffled loudly. Another wiped tears from their sleeve. Because this wasn't just a child speaking. This was a survivor reclaiming her voice. Finally. The defense attorney stumbled up, voice cracking. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's a child. She doesn't—" But the judge didn't look at him. Not once. He was staring at Mila, at her courage, at her clarity, and maybe at the unspoken testimony of a dog who didn't need words to validate hers. Officer Blake looked like he needed to sit, or stand, or move. He couldn't decide, because his K9 had just backed a child's accusation in front of an entire courtroom. Then something happened that made the tension spike even higher. Mila's eyes didn't leave Derek. Not once. She watched him, head tilted slightly, as if waiting to see whether the bad man would keep pretending. It was quiet. Dead quiet. And in that silence, Derek flinched. The tiniest movement. But everyone saw it. And that was the moment the courtroom realized the trial had changed. Right there. Right in front of them. In one sentence from the smallest voice in the room. For a moment after Mila said those 4 words, Ranger saw it. The bad man. The courtroom was frozen so tight, it felt like time had slipped and forgotten to keep moving. But then, something even heavier began to rise in the air. Not panic, not shock. Something deeper, darker, angrier. And it was coming from her. Because Mila wasn't done. She kept staring at Derek Cole. That same blank, haunted stare she walked in with. But now there was something else there. Something sharper. Something that didn't belong on a face that tiny. Pain. Real pain. She pulled in a shaky breath, her chest lifting under that oversized pink coat. Her little hands curled into fists for a moment, then loosened again, like she was deciding whether to hold the truth in or let it spill. And then she said it. Soft. Fragile. But clear enough to cut through the silence like a razor. He hurt Mommy. Nobody breathed. Not Ranger. Not Blake. Not the jurors. Not even the judge. It wasn't the words themselves. It was how she said them. This wasn't a rehearsed line. This wasn't a coached answer. This was a memory she'd been trying to outrun, finally catching her. She swallowed hard. Her chin trembled, in a way that tore something inside everyone listening. Then, he pushed her. A woman in the gallery let out a soft cry, slapping a hand over her mouth. One juror blinked rapidly, eyes suddenly glassy. Even the prosecutor, trained to never react, pressed his lips together until they turned white. Mila's voice cracked again, not from fear, but from remembering too vividly. She cried. So much. It was the so much that did it. Those 2 little words hit harder than anything so far. Her tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't even emotional in the way adults cry or shout. It was simple, matter of fact, like she was describing the sky, or her shoes, or breakfast. Because when something traumatic becomes normal, that's how kids talk about it. And that broke the room. Officer Blake Harris, Ranger's handler, usually a brick wall of discipline, clenched his fists so tight his knuckles bulged. You could see the tendons tightening under his uniform sleeves. His jaw twitched, like he was fighting the urge to stand up, cross the room, and drag Derek Cole out by the throat. But he didn't move. Not an inch. He just kept staring at Mila, eyes burning with a mix of protectiveness and fury only someone sworn to protect truly understands. One male juror cleared his throat, trying to keep composure. He failed. A tear slipped out anyway. Judge Halford leaned back, eyes closing for a single beat. The kind of beat a man takes when he hears something he wishes he didn't have to hear, because he knows he'll never forget it. Mila kept talking. Not fast, not slow. Just steady. Steady like a child repeating something burned into memory. "Mommy was scared," she whispered. "He yelled. Loud." She flinched at her own memory. "And she fell. She didn't get back up." Someone in the audience stood halfway, then sat back down when their knees gave out. Ranger shifted closer, his body moving protectively in front of her legs, but still giving her space. He didn't growl, though everyone could feel he wanted to. His ears were forward, eyes locked on her face like he was memorizing every emotion. And somehow, that made her braver. Pitched volume. He wouldn't stop," she whispered. Her little hand pressed to her chest like it hurt to breathe. "She told him to please stop." The word please came out broken, like she'd heard it too many times. The prosecutor swallowed. The defense attorney looked sick. Derek Cole twitched, guilt and fear breaking through his face. But Mila wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at Ranger. Kids don't lie when they're looking at someone they trust. "He barked," Mila whispered, fingers brushing Ranger's neck. "He tried to help Mommy. He was so loud." She sniffled. "But he couldn't get in." That line tore through the courtroom like a blade. Ranger let out a low, aching whine, a sound that wasn't an animal noise. It was grief. Pure, simple grief. Mila touched his muzzle gently. "You tried. I know." Blake put a fist to his mouth, trying to steady himself. A juror whispered, "Jesus, she's only 3. But age didn't matter. Not in that moment. Because Mila wasn't speaking like a toddler. She was speaking like someone who'd carried a nightmare too big for her shoulders. A nightmare she finally had a chance to unload. And when a child unloads something like that, the whole room feels it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in this deep, quiet way that felt like the whole room finally understood the weight she'd been carrying. The first person to lose their composure wasn't who you'd expect. It wasn't her aunt. It wasn't the gallery. It wasn't even the prosecutor. It was one of the jurors, a woman in her mid-40s, the kind who had sat through tough cases without flinching. But this wasn't something you just sit through. She turned her head fast, like she didn't want anyone to see, and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then wiped again. Then again. But tears kept coming. Steady. Unstoppable. Silent. And in a strange way, her crying gave everyone else permission to stop pretending they were okay. A man 3 seats down swallowed hard, blinking too fast, pressing a finger under his glasses like he was trying to hold a tear in place. Didn't work. A tear slipped anyway. Even the bailiff, this big guy with shoulders like a refrigerator, shifted his stance as if something had caught in his throat. But the moment that really hit the room came from the bench. Judge Halford. This man had been doing this job for almost 30 years. He'd sentenced killers, gang members, abusers, all without shaking. But now, his eyes dropped to his desk. Just for a second. But a second too long for someone like him. His jaw clenched. His fingers tapped his gavel, not to restore order, but because he needed something solid to hold on to. And when he spoke, his voice, usually booming, came out low, rough. Give her a moment. Not a command, not an instruction, a plea. Because he needed a moment too. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. Not for those few seconds. Time, thousands. It felt like a room full of parents, siblings, neighbors, people whose hearts had just taken the same punch at the same time. And suddenly, no one cared about procedure or objections or strategy. They cared about her. Little Mila, standing there, hands trembling, eyes glossy. Ranger pressed against her legs like a shield made of muscle and love. Not a single person in that room, not one, still saw her as just a toddler. She wasn't a toddler. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a question mark in a case full of them. She was a witness, a real one, a brave one. Maybe the bravest one Colorado had ever seen. Mila wiped her nose with her sleeve, a motion that should have been cute, but instead squeezed every heart in that room at once. Her aunt sniffled in the front row, hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned white. The prosecutor wasn't pretending to take notes anymore. His pen hung loosely, forgotten. And Blake, tough, trained, disciplined Blake, stared at her like he was holding himself back from running up there and hugging her. Ranger stayed right at her side, unmoving, patient, steady, a breathing anchor. The defense attorney didn't look confident now. The color had drained from his face. He looked like a man who suddenly realized his entire case had been built on the assumption that a child couldn't speak. And now that she'd spoken, everything he had left felt paper thin. But the moment people would talk about for months afterward came from the jury box. The same woman who'd wiped her tears earlier placed her hand over her heart. Not dramatically. Not for show, just instinctively. Like she needed to steady the ache swelling in her chest. And the man beside her whispered, just loud enough to be heard. God, she's stronger than all of us. He didn't mean it as a comment. He meant it as a truth, a fact, a realization that settled over everyone. Because courage doesn't always look like shouting or fighting or standing tall. Sometimes it looks like a tiny girl in a pink coat, voice trembling, telling a room full of strangers about the worst night of her life, and doing it anyway. Ranger nudged her hand gently, grounding her with a steady, solid presence only a dog like him can give. Mila blinked slow, and for the first time her shoulders relaxed. Barely, but visibly. Another juror wiped at her eyes. The judge cleared his throat, finally sitting up straighter. Not because he was fine, but because he needed to pull himself together for her. He looked at Mila like she had just done the impossible, carried something none of them could have carried if they tried. And honestly, she had. When he finally spoke, everyone could hear the emotion he was fighting back. "Thank you, Mila." Simple words, but they echoed like a prayer. And maybe that's what this moment was. A prayer whispered through a courtroom that had just witnessed a kind of bravery adults spend their whole lives searching for. Because in that instant, everyone understood. Mila Thompson wasn't just a witness. She was the heartbeat of this entire case, and she was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. But no, they didn't settle. They shifted, because the next moment wasn't about fear or shock or even pain. It was about something the room desperately needed without realizing it. Hope. Mila's tiny shoulders trembled again, like she was caught between two worlds. The nightmare she'd lived through, and the fragile safety she'd found standing next to Ranger. She opened her mouth to keep talking, but nothing came out. Just a small, broken sound. A hiccup of emotion that pulled the air straight out of everyone's lungs. Her chin quivered. Her breath hitched. Her little fingers curled near her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together with nothing but sheer will. And then Ranger moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just moved. Slow as snowfall, gentle as a heartbeat. He stepped closer to her legs and lowered his head, placing it right on her lap, right against her pink coat. Like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Like he'd been waiting for the exact second she'd need him the most. His eyes lifted to her face, steady, warm, unshakably loyal. And if eyes could speak, his were saying, "You're not alone. Not now. Not ever." Something rippled through the room, a warmth, a hush, a shift from grief into something softer, gentler, almost bright. You could actually hear a few people inhale, the kind of breath someone takes when they witness something sacred, something they know they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Mila's little hand shook as she lifted it and placed it on Ranger's head. Her fingers sank into his fur like she was holding on to an anchor in the middle of a storm. She whispered something, too soft for anyone to hear, but Ranger responded anyway. His tail thumped once, a single, heavy, grounding thump. Not playful, not excited. A reassurance, a promise. And the energy in the courtroom changed instantly. The fear, it loosened its grip. The grief, it softened around the edges. The cold, stiff air people had been suffocating under since Mila walked in. It warmed, like someone lit a small fire in the center of the room. People didn't cry this time. They didn't gasp. They didn't whisper. They just watched. With this quiet, awe-struck look, like they were witnessing the human version of a sunrise in the middle of a blizzard. Because that's what Ranger was. A sunrise. A flashlight in a cave. A warm hand in the dark. And somehow, without saying a word, that dog made everyone believe Mila could make it through the rest of this testimony. made them believe they could handle hearing it too. Her breathing steadied. A small puff of air left her lips, like she'd been holding it since the day everything went wrong. Her shoulders eased, barely, but enough for the front row to see. Her aunt covered her mouth, eyes bright with relief. The prosecutor closed his eyes and exhaled, like he'd been underwater and Ranger had just pulled him up. Even Judge Halford leaned forward, elbows on his desk, watching the two of them like he'd forgotten he had a courtroom to run. And honestly, in that moment, he didn't. Nobody did. All anyone cared about was the way this little girl leaned into this dog like she was learning how to feel safe again. Her fingers curled into his fur. Her breathing synced with his. Her shoulders stopped shaking. And then she whispered, "Okay." Not loudly, not confidently, but in that tiny voice, there was something new. Not courage, not yet, but the seed of courage. The kind that only grows when a child realizes she doesn't have to face a monster alone. Ranger pressed his nose gently against her wrist. Her eyes softened. Her lips relaxed. Her brows unfurrowed. Hope, real, honest, warm hope, settled around her like a blanket. And the entire courtroom felt it, like someone cracked the ice that had been choking the room. The snowstorm outside didn't seem as cold. The fluorescent lights didn't feel as harsh. And Mila didn't look as impossibly small as she had minutes before. Because beside her, standing guard like a soldier made of loyalty and instinct, was Ranger. The light in a dark winter. The warmth in a frozen room. The witness who didn't need words to remind a terrified little girl she wasn't fighting this alone. And let me ask you, honestly, from your heart, in a moment like that, who do you think gave her courage? Ranger, her own little heart. Both, because some battles need two souls standing together, because hope is one thing. Courage, real courage, that's something else entirely. And Mila, she found it. Not slowly, not eventually, all at once. She lifted her head from Ranger's fur, her little fingers still tangled in his coat, and something inside her face shifted. The fear that had been gripping her, it loosened. The shaking, it stilled. For the first time since she walked through those heavy courthouse doors, Mila looked steady, strong even. She straightened up, not by much, because she was tiny and the witness chair swallowed her whole, but enough that every adult in that room felt the change before she even spoke. Her breathing evened out, her eyes fixed forward. Her hand slid off Ranger's back, but she kept one finger hooked in his fur, like a safety line. And Derek Cole? He felt it too. You could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, just slightly, in the way he blinked, too slow, in the way he tried to hide the fact he suddenly became very aware of the little girl staring at him. Mila inhaled, a deep, shaky breath, but a brave one. Then she did something no one expected. She lifted her arm and pointed. Right at him. Not at the prosecutor, not at the judge, not at the ground, at Derek Cole. Her hand didn't tremble. Her voice didn't break. Her fear didn't return. Instead, she said the three words that cracked the whole courtroom open. It was him. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was simple, small, precise, but it hit like thunder. A gasp erupted, not from one person, but from what felt like the entire room. A woman's hand flew to her chest. A juror jerked upright. A man whispered, "Jesus," without meaning to. And Derek? Derek stumbled, literally stumbled backward against the defense table. His hand shot out to steady himself, but he missed the edge and grabbed air instead. His face drained of color, not fear alone, but guilt clawing its way up. His lawyer tried to rise, tried to object, tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Because how do you object to the truth? Judge Halford's eyes snapped upward, wide for the first time in the entire trial. Mila was still pointing at Derek, arms straight, expression steady, undeniable. And Ranger stepped forward, one paw then another, angling his body between Mila and the man she had just accused. No growl, no bark, just pure, unbreakable instinct. Like he was saying, "I'm here, say it, I'll stand with you." And Mila did. Her voice, barely a whisper, but strong enough to shake the walls. "He hurt Mommy." You could have heard a pin drop in the hallway outside. The prosecutor spoke, voice trembling. "Your Honor, the witness has identified the defendant." The defense attorney finally found words, shaky, desperate. "Your Honor, she's a child. She doesn't—" But the judge didn't look at him. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He looked at Mila, at her bravery, at her strength, at the way she refused to look away from the man who took everything from her. Then Judge Halford did something almost unheard of in a Colorado courtroom. He made a decision without asking for another word. He lifted his gavel, slowly, deliberately, like lifting the weight of the entire state. The room held its breath, even Derek. And when the gavel came down, it wasn't just a sound. It was a verdict. Bang! Judge Halford's voice boomed, echoing off every wooden wall. Guilty. Just one word. Just one strike. But it broke the tension that had been choking Aspen Creek all winter long. People didn't cheer. That would have felt wrong. They cried, openly, unashamedly, like people cry when a storm finally breaks and they're still standing. A woman sobbed into her scarf. A man wiped his eyes. A juror bowed her head, tears dripping onto her notes. Blake exhaled, a long, exhausted breath he'd been holding since this trial began. And Mila? Mila didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't collapse. She just lowered her arm, reached for Ranger's fur, and leaned into him like the world had finally stopped spinning. Her eyes softened, her shoulders relaxed, and in that tiny, quiet moment, she did something no one else in that room could have done. She delivered justice. A 3-year-old, the smallest voice in the courthouse. And yet, her voice carried the farthest. The whole room exhaled, not one person at a time, not in pockets or waves, all at once. It was like the entire courthouse had been holding its breath for weeks, maybe months. And now that final word had finally released the pressure holding everybody upright. People slumped in their seats, trembling with relief. Some cried silently, others openly. A couple of jurors leaned into each other, exhausted in a way that wasn't physical, but the kind of tired you feel deep in your bones after carrying something too heavy for too long. But Mila didn't cry. Not right away. She just stood there, frozen in the middle of all that grown-up emotion. Like she didn't know what to do now that the truth was out and the monster had finally been named. And then the judge dismissed the courtroom. Chairs scraped. People shuffled to their feet. Someone whispered a shaky "thank God." Another let out a sob that had clearly been trapped since the trial began. But Mila didn't move. Not until Ranger did. He stepped forward, not rushing, not pouncing, just walking with this confident, gentle stride. And the moment she saw him, something inside her cracked. Her whole tiny body jolted, like her heart had suddenly woken up after being numb far too long. And before anyone could blink, Mila ran. Ran in that wobbly, determined way only toddlers can. Fast but unsteady, arms half flailing, like emotion was dragging her forward faster than her little legs could keep up. She didn't run to her aunt. She didn't run to Blake. Not to the prosecutor or any adult reaching out for her. She ran straight to Ranger. And when she reached him, she didn't slow down. She didn't ease into it. She crashed into him, this tiny pink blur launching herself into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked Ranger over. But he stayed upright. Of course he did. He braced himself, lowered his head, and let her wrap her little arms around his neck like she was holding on to the last piece of warmth in the whole world. And right there, in the center of a cold Colorado courtroom, Ranger did something he hadn't done the entire trial. He wagged his tail. Not a polite swish, not a careful, trained motion. A full, deep, powerful wag. One that thumped against the floor like a heartbeat. Then he leaned into her, pressed his head into her shoulder, nuzzling, breathing her in, reassuring her in ways no human word could ever match. A murmur rippled through the room, soft gasps, quiet sniffles, hands covering mouths. Because that moment was different. This wasn't a service dog providing support. This wasn't training. This was love. Simple, honest, healing love. The kind that wakes something up in you. Something warm, something soft, something you forgot you needed. A woman whispered, "Oh my God." A juror wiped tears like she was embarrassed by how loudly they were falling. The prosecutor turned away, pretending to grab his folder, but everyone saw him swipe his eyes. Even Judge Halford, the man who'd spent 30 years learning not to show emotion, lowered his head. Just for a moment. Just long enough to steady himself. and the winter that had wrapped itself around that courtroom. Not the literal winter, but the emotional one, started to melt. Not slowly, not subtly. It melted like sunlight finally breaking through the clouds after a storm that felt like it would never end. You could feel it in the air, in the warmth rising from the people watching, in the relief radiating from Mila's tiny shoulders as she buried her face in Ranger's fur. She wasn't shaking anymore. She wasn't whispering anymore. She wasn't trying to be brave anymore. She was just safe. Finally safe. Blake walked up slowly, careful not to break whatever miracle was happening. He crouched beside them, placing a steady hand on Ranger's side. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, voice rough, then softer. "You did real good." Ranger's ear twitched, but he didn't move, didn't shift, didn't break the embrace. Mila's voice came out muffled against Ranger's fur. He's okay now?" Blake swallowed, nodded, answering in the gentlest voice he'd used all year. "Yeah, sweetheart. He's okay." A pause. "And so are you." That's when Mila let out the tiniest sob, not loud, not broken, but a soft, shaky breath that sounded like the first time she'd allowed herself to feel relief since the night everything happened. And nobody, absolutely nobody, stayed untouched by that sound. Because that wasn't just crying, that was healing. The beginning of it, anyway. The courtroom no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like the first warm day after a brutal winter. The air softer, the light gentler, the world a little kinder. Ranger licked her cheek, just once, soft, careful, and Mila laughed, actually laughed, this small, breathy giggle that hit everyone like sunlight. And in that moment, everyone knew the trial was over, but her healing had just begun. Creek to find out what had happened. Because stories like this, they don't stay small, they don't stay local, they spread fast. Within 2 days, every news station in Colorado was running the headline, "The Silent Witness of Aspen Creek." And the picture beneath it was always the same. Mila in that oversized pink coat, one hand buried in Ranger's fur, her little face half hidden, but safe. Then the story reached Wyoming, then Utah, then the Midwest, then California, then New York, then everywhere. People couldn't stop talking about it. Not because it was dramatic, though yeah, it was. Not because it was heartbreaking, though it absolutely shattered people, but because it was real, because it was pure, because it reminded everyone that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it's 3 years old, sometimes it walks on 4 legs. News anchors spoke softly when telling the story. Talk show hosts cried repeating Mila's name. One station in San Francisco even ran a full segment titled, "The Dog Who Remembered and the Child Who Found Her Voice." Reporters traveled to Aspen Creek hoping to interview Blake Harris, or even just catch a glimpse of Ranger. But Blake always said the same thing. It wasn't just Ranger. Don't make this all about him. Mila's the hero, too. And Blake wasn't wrong. People wanted the hero to be the dog. And don't get me wrong, Ranger deserved every bit of praise. But the truth was more complicated. Because yes, Ranger was loyal. Ranger stood by Mila. Ranger helped her feel safe enough to speak. Time, 1500 mams. But he didn't carry the pain. He didn't face the trauma. He didn't walk into a courtroom full of strangers and point at the man who hurt her mother. Mila did. Mila, tiny, trembling, brave little Mila, did what adults twice her age couldn't always do. She told the truth. She stood up for someone she loved. She faced the monster. And that is courage. People around the country began sending letters to the Aspen Creek Police Department. Handwritten notes, drawings, cards from children, toys for Ranger, stuffed animals for Mila. Some messages simply said, "Thank you for being brave. You helped more people than you know. You made us believe in good again." One little boy from Oregon sent a crayon drawing of Ranger with a superhero cape. Under it he'd written, "Dogs don't need capes to save people." But the drawing that made Blake truly cry wasn't about Ranger. It was about Mila, a little girl in pink with a flickering golden light drawn around her. The child wrote, "She's the brave one. Ranger just helped." And that was the truth nobody could deny anymore. Because while the country called Ranger the silent witness of Aspen Creek, Blake corrected them every time. "No, I was in the courtroom. I saw what happened. Ranger didn't carry that truth alone. Mila did. She's the hero. Ranger is the helper." People tried to argue, reporters, fans, dog lovers, but Blake never budged. "My partner did what he was trained to do, but Mila, she did what no one trained her for. She stood up to the worst night of her life, and she won." Blake meant every word, because he'd been 3 feet away when Mila pointed at Derek Cole. He'd seen terror transform into something fierce. He'd heard the strength hiding inside her tiny voice. He'd watched justice fall into place because of her, and he'd never forget it. Not in 10 years. Not in 50. Not ever. Even Ranger seemed to know the spotlight wasn't his alone. Whenever people came to the precinct hoping to meet him, Ranger always looked around for Mila, like he was waiting for the other half of his story. And she usually did. Her aunt brought her by sometimes, short visits, quiet ones. And every single time Mila ran into Ranger's fur like it was a place she belonged. And maybe it was. Because healing doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happens slowly, quietly, in bits and pieces, in the safety of a familiar heartbeat, in the softness of a dog's fur, in the warmth of someone who's proven they'll never leave. So yeah, Ranger became famous. His name spread everywhere. Kids drew him. Adults admired him. Reporters adored him. But Blake Harris never let anyone forget the truth. It wasn't just Ranger. Mila saved Mila. And in a world tired of darkness, tired of heartbreak, tired of cruelty. That was the redemption people didn't know they needed. Because the bravest heroes don't always wear uniforms, or badges, or capes. Sometimes, the bravest hero wears a pink coat, holds a silver stuffed bunny, and stands just tall enough to reach a dog's shoulder. That's the hero America fell in love with. And honestly, after the whole country started talking about Ranger and Mila, after headlines spread, after interviews aired, after drawings from children across America piled up at the station, there was still one question people kept asking. What made it all happen? How did a 3-year-old change the direction of a trial, and maybe even change the heart of a nation? And every time someone asked that, Blake Harris, who didn't love cameras, who didn't enjoy microphones, who spoke more easily with Ranger than with reporters, gave the same quiet smile, a tired smile, a proud smile. And he'd say, it wasn't the adults, it wasn't the judge, it wasn't the lawyers, it was them. He'd nod toward Ranger, then toward Mila. Both of them. But it wasn't until one interview, a live one, recorded outside the Aspen Creek Police Department, that Blake finally said the words that would echo far beyond Colorado. Reporter: Officer Harris, what do you think people should take from this case? What's the lesson we walk away with? Blake paused. He looked down at Ranger, sitting beside him like a statue made of loyalty and instinct. Then he looked at Mila, standing a few steps away, holding her aunt's hand, wearing a new pink coat that actually fit her this time. She wasn't scared now. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't trembling. She was smiling, shy, tiny, but real. Blake inhaled. Winter fog curled in front of him as he spoke. A child doesn't have to be big to tell the truth. Reporters leaned in, cameras zoomed, people watching at home sat up straighter. Then Blake continued, placing his hand on Ranger's back. And a dog doesn't need words to stand on the side of justice. The reporter blinked, thrown by the softness in his tone. But Blake wasn't finished. Sometimes, when two broken hearts stand next to each other, the world has no choice but to stop and listen. And that was it. That was the quote that hit America like a wave. Newspapers printed it in bold. The clip went viral. Millions shared it. People cried in their cars, paused their TVs, reached for tissues. Because it wasn't just poetic. It was true. Mila's tiny voice, soft, trembling, honest, carried farther than any lawyer ever could. And Ranger, silent, steady, grounding, proved that sometimes the strongest testimony comes from the ones who can't talk. The world didn't just hear them. The world felt them. And as days turned to weeks, Aspen Creek slowly returned to normal. Or as normal as a small mountain town can be after becoming the emotional center of an entire nation. The snow thawed. The courthouse quieted. Media trucks rolled out. Streets cleared. But the story stayed. People walked differently, softer, kinder, like they'd been reminded of something they forgot. Bravery doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it cries. Sometimes it clings to a dog's fur and finds safety in a steady heartbeat. One afternoon, weeks later, Blake, Ranger, and Mila ended up in the same park. It wasn't planned. Mila's aunt brought her to play. Blake brought Ranger to stretch. And when Mila saw Ranger, she squealed, the happiest sound Blake had ever heard. She ran straight into Ranger's chest. But this time there was no fear, just joy, just a kid being a kid again. Ranger wagged his tail so hard he knocked over a plastic snowman. Mila giggled so loud half the park turned to look. Time 1600 mems. It was healing, visible, undeniable, happening right there on muddy spring grass. And Blake, for the first time since the trial, felt something that tasted like peace. Watching Mila twirl, watching Ranger trot after her, watching laughter return to the child who once walked frozen into a courtroom. Blake realized something. Maybe justice wasn't only the verdict. Maybe justice was this moment, this child laughing, this dog standing guard, this life moving forward. He whispered again, softer this time, just for himself. A child doesn't need to be big to tell the truth. A dog doesn't need words to stand for what's right. Then, after a breath, and when two hurt hearts find each other, the world listens. The wind carried his words over the snowy mountains of Aspen Creek, making sure they'd never be forgotten. Stories like this don't fade. They become anchors, reminders, proof that the smallest voices can create the biggest echoes. And now that this story is closing, let me ask you, the one who's been here through all 12 parts, which message stays with you the most? A. That bravery can come from the smallest voice. B. That loyalty doesn't need words. C. That healing begins when two hurting souls stand together.